The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this Employment Law Changes webinar. My name is Robin. Many of you may know me from our weekly training webinars. Because there's a lot of people on the call right now, everyone is on mute. But if you have any questions during the webinar, please don't hesitate to type them in and we'll try to address them at the end. Now let me take a moment to introduce the president of Shoshana Technologies, Tom Boyles. Tom has over 20 years in the home care world, working closely with people in every aspect of the industry. He has spent a lot of time, particularly in the last few months, speaking with agency owners and staff, as well as legal experts, to get kind of an overall view of the upcoming changes. He has a really unique perspective around this issue, so hello, Tom.
Hi, Robin. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for attending the webinar today. As Robin said, we have the Rosemark scheduling system. It's a great product, and we'd love to talk with you about it another time, but I want to make it clear that this is not a sales pitch. Many of you on the call today are Rosemark customers, but many of you are not. I will talk about the role of software in general in handling these changes, but not specifically about how Rosemark does it. For you Rosemark customers on the call, we will be doing follow-up webinars on the details, so keep your eye open for those. And as you know, of course, you can always call and get direct support on these issues anytime you want. What we're offering today is perspective, not a prescription. I'm not an attorney, but I do have what I believe is a unique perspective on the industry. I have many conversations with different agency owners and staff, and I see lots of different approaches and attitudes that people take in running their agencies and responding to changes as they happen in the industry. So I hope you find my perspective helpful. I look forward to interacting with you about them through the questions at the end and also just through further conversations down the road. So let's get started here. Okay, so let's quick overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to take a look at the background of all this, the Fair Labor Standards Act, how that came to be. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I think it's good to have a foundation for that. We'll look at the rules themselves, the things that are changing with this final rule, the parts of the law that are changing and that are affecting our industry. Talk about some of the concerns that I hear from customers every day. And we'll look at some overall approaches that people are taking to respond to these changes. We'll look at the role of software in managing your agency in response to these changes. And along the way, of course, I've been looking into this a lot and running across various resources. So we have a little page at the end with some other resources that you might find useful. And we'll take some questions at the end. You can type those questions in as we go, as Robin mentioned, if you don't want to worry about forgetting them. But we are not going to interrupt I'm going to just talk at you for a little while here. So, all right. So let's take a look at the Fair Labor Standards Act. That is the law that is at the core of all of this. It was created back in 1938 in response to what arguably were some pretty horrific working conditions that people faced, child labor, some pretty bad stuff. So a law came into effect back in 1938, and over the years it's been updated from time to time. As the world keeps changing, politics keeps changing, all sorts of stuff changes, so it gets updated from time to time. Back in 1974, this actually took effect in 75, but the updates happened in 74. There was they added domestic workers to coverage under the law. At the same time, as they often do when they make a law or they make a change to the law, they make exceptions, and this was no exception. They added an exemption for companion care. Now, over the years from that time, the home care industry arguably has really grown up in this time since then, and it has grown up in an environment where that companionship exemption was in place. So companions, people classified as companions, which applies pretty much to all of our caregivers. We're not required to be paid minimum wage or to be paid overtime, along with a few other things. Well, fast forward to 19, I'm dating myself, 2013, I'm not that old, 2013, and they removed that companionship exemption. And that pretty much applies to all of you. No third-party providers are going to be able to claim an exemption for companionship any longer. And those changes take effect starting in 2015, January 1st, 2015. Now, some states are already doing that or something like it. So, you are in different boats out there, but we're all headed in the same direction. We all have essentially the same set of concerns. Let's look at the rules that are the specific parts of the law that are changing that are involved. The minimum wage requirement. So that's the fact that we now have to make sure that caregivers are paid at least the minimum wage. They have to be paid overtime. They have to be paid travel time. I'll get into a little more detail about each of these in a second. And then there's the live-in companions exemption that is also part of this going away. And that's perhaps one of the thorniest ones for a lot of our customers, people who are doing live-in care. This really changes the game for that. It's one of the areas that I get the most questions and the most gnashing of teeth about. Okay, so let's look at the minimum wage. So essentially it's now required that you pay at least the federal minimum wage for hours worked by caregivers. Most agencies, I believe, are already doing this. Looking at data that I have access to, it's pretty clear that at least for the main hourly care kind of stuff, most people are paying at least $8 an hour these days that I see. And of course there's a lot of variation in that, but most of what I see is between $8 and $11 an hour. Of course, that starts to get skewed a little bit when you look at live-in care. All the issues around how much of that time are they working, how much of that time are they sleeping, all that stuff. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment. But in general, most agencies are already doing something like this, and it's probably the least of our worries in terms of the changes that are happening. This is a map of the United States, as you probably recognize, and it's color-coded based on minimum wage rates. Now, this comes directly from the Department of Labor's website. At the end, I'll give you the link for that, or the URL for that, in case you're interested. It's a very useful page for seeing the interaction between the federal laws and individual state laws. But in general, it's pretty clear from this that most states have at least as high a minimum wage as federal, and many have more than that. There's very few that have either no minimum wage law or lower than the federal. But in general, though, part of the law is that whichever is higher prevails. So if a state has a lower than the federal, you're going to have to pay the federal. If a state has higher than the federal, you're going to have to pay the state minimum wage. But anyway, this is a very useful site, because you can go to your particular state and it'll give you not just about the minimum wage, but it also talks about a little more detail about your state's requirements about overtime as well. Overtime, this is the big bad one. Basically, you got to pay people overtime for anything over 40 hours is the quick answer to it. Now, quite a number of states have, or a number of states I should say, have daily requirements, and this was accurate according to the Department of Labor very recently, but I had a conversation with somebody in the state of Washington yesterday, and it sounds like that this might be a little behind the times. So most of you aren't having to deal with the daily requirement, but some of you are certainly. The other part of it is the rates. Now overtime is a complicated thing in any industry, but the way the FLSA reads, it's saying that you have to pay 1.5 times the regular rate of pay. Now, regular rate of pay is an interesting phrase in an industry where the employees generally have a rate of pay. That's pretty simple. In our industry, a lot of agencies pay caregivers different rates for different situations. They might get different rates on the weekends or during the week, during the day versus at night, for one client versus another, for different types of care. So it can be pretty different. So what I've got here now is 3 different ways of dealing with this, deciding, well, what is the rate of pay when a person works under different pay rates for different shifts. So we have the pay rate could be decided based on selected shifts. So if you have different rates of pay on different shifts, you select a shift and that's the rate of pay you use for figuring overtime. It could be averaged, so you look at the entire week and come up with an average rate. Another way to do it is to pick a standard overtime rate for a caregiver. 3 different approaches, all arguably have their place. So let's look at what that means, because this can be really mind-bending stuff. We spend a lot of time around here talking about overtime and all the different components of it, but it's helpful maybe to get a little bit of a tutorial about how this all works. So if we are to figure out the rate to use, so what do we multiply by 1.5 to get that overtime? Here's a case where we got the caregiver is working 48 hours during this week. They're working 9 to 3 shifts on some days, 3 to 11 shifts on other days, and they get 2 different rates of pay. So one simple way of, and maybe the most kind of common sense way to apply overtime would be to say, well, when they get to the end of the week and when they go into overtime, that shift or shifts or parts of shifts are going to be what we use. So in this case, a shift that has a rate of $10 an hour hit overtime, if you will, and so we're going to multiply 10 by 1.5 and get 15. Another way to do it, still on a selected shift, here's a different way of doing it. So here we're saying, well, we want to apply some of that overtime to a particular shift. Maybe that Wednesday shift was something special, a client requested it, whatever the case might be. In this case, it's exactly the same schedule, exactly the same situation, except here what we're doing is we're going to pay 9 times 1.5 for the hours on Wednesday, and $10 times 1.5 for the hours on Sunday. Another way to do it. Another way is to use an averaged rate. Now, to my mind, this is probably the most compliant, most generally compliant way to do it, because you're looking at each week, you're looking at the entire pay, the entire base pay that the caregiver would get if you ignored overtime. You're then dividing that by the total number of hours, and that is the averaged rate. The main problem I see, we have customers who are doing this, and the main problem I see with this is that it confuses the heck out of caregivers, because each time they get overtime, it's coming up with a different rate. The calculations we used here in the example happen to come out to a nice round $9.50, but I've seen them where they're, $11.23 or, whatever. It's different each time, which can lead to some real confusion by caregivers, and I don't blame them. And then, oh darn, I went too far. There we are. And then the other is to use a standard overtime rate. So we're basically saying, okay, this caregiver's standard rate is $9. So regardless of the particulars of any one individual shift, or even the aggregate of the shifts, we're saying that any of the hours that go into overtime, which is 8 hours in the example, that's going to be paid at 9 times 1.5. So there's a quick tutorial on these different ways of doing it. There are probably other ways of doing it too. These are the most common ones that I have conversations with people about. And you know, we'll get into a little bit of the concerns around all this. One of them is just, you know, are you in compliance or not? So by having a clear process for doing it, you're much more likely to be safe and sound in terms of compliance than if you're kind of winging it. So it's important to think through these things and come up with what is your approach going to be. What do you feel comfortable with? That might involve conversations with professionals of various kinds. But these are some of the main approaches that you want to take to figuring that out. Okay, travel time is another thing on our list. Travel time means time that is spent traveling from job site to job site. So it's pretty obvious when you have something like a carpenter, a plumber, or somebody who's going around to different job sites. In home care, it's essentially going from one client's shift to another client's shift. So here we have a couple little houses here, though. That's one client, and then they go to the other client. They have to be paid for that time now. Now, that sounds simple on the face, but there are some wrinkles to that. So if they have a single shift during the day, they go to the shift, they do their work, they go home. None of that's travel time. That's just commuting to work. And that is not considered by the FLSA or by the IRS or anybody else to be travel time that needs to be paid. It's not part of their workday. However, when they go to one shift and then they travel to another shift, that will be that squiggly line you see there, that's travel time. Well, that still doesn't answer all of the situations that come up. So how long between shifts? What if they go to a shift and then they go home, and then sometime later they go to another shift and go home? Is that travel time? It's not terribly clear, and from my reading of the law, they aren't offering any certainty about that. In general, though, what we recommend is that if the shifts are an hour or less apart, that you really should pay for travel time between those two locations. I have customers who make it 3 hours. So somebody might work in the morning, have 3 or 4 hours off, and they go back. You have to have a clear policy about that. Caregivers need to know what that policy is, you know, that's the main thing. I would say a good rule of thumb is an hour between shifts, but you have to come to your own policy about that. And then there's live-ins. No, this does not mean it's time to take a nap. This means it's time to talk about live-ins. So it used to be that there was an implied, or there could have been an express one, but often it was just an implied agreement that you aren't paying for sleep time. A caregiver is living in the house, and live-ins that's a little bit of a squishy term because it can also apply to 12-hour and 24-hour care. They're there for an extended period of time, and part of that time they are not working. So what's really important now is that you have an explicit agreement that while they are sleeping, they don't get paid. That is not paid time, that's personal time, sleeping and eating meals, that they have a certain amount of time allocated for that. But sleep time must be tracked, and interruptions must be tracked. So what that means is you can't just lay down a nice tidy law or a tidy rule that says, all right, when you're there for 24 hours, 8 of those hours you're sleeping and you're off the clock, and 16 of those hours you're getting paid. that's okay to have that as your basic starting point, but be aware that you really do have to have a way for caregivers to log times when they would be off but they aren't, and you have to have a way to pay them for that. Now, it is okay under the law to task them with doing that, so in a way they're the only ones who really can fully log what's going on in the home since they're the ones there. But when it comes down to it, you as an agency owner are responsible for collecting and keeping those records and having them available. So that's pretty clear. So there's lots of concerns around this. As I've said, I have lots of conversations with people. Some of them are close to the point of panic. I'd say most people are just rolling up their sleeves and figuring out what to do, and that's really what we're about here. I don't recommend panicking. So maybe the top concern is that profitability will evaporate with all these additional costs. Many agencies are already working on rather thin margins, and suddenly those margins just got a lot thinner. The management of all this could be quite a thing. That keeping track of all these new requirements just adds to the headaches. The threat of wage and hour lawsuits. If you aren't or don't appear to be, or you get a caregiver who's disgruntled and they don't like the way you're doing things, you have additional exposure about that now that you didn't used to have. Not insignificantly, a lot of people I'm talking to are really concerned about the effect that this will have on their actual ability to provide the right care for clients, which really speaks to the kind of the culture of home care. I mean, people are worried about the money, but they also are really concerned about their clients getting what they need, and for that matter, their caregivers getting what they need. The loss of losing good caregivers and clients is a big concern because of changes to the way you charge for things, or changes to the number of hours you can give them. All these things, potentially you could lose some clients or some caregivers or both over this. Then there's finding enough caregivers. That's always a challenge to home care agencies, that balance between enough clients, enough caregivers. Finding enough good caregivers is always a concern, and this magnifies that. So let's kind of quickly go. I'm not going to, we could spend all day talking about each one of these, but I'm going to make a quick run through these, just offering some thoughts about how to address some of these concerns, because I do believe that they are addressable, and that most of you are going to do fine. It's not going to be easy for a lot of you, but together we're going to make it work, because the work that you're doing is so important. A way has to be found. So profitability will evaporate. So some of the ways to address this are to distribute costs. So in other words, find ways to move the money around, maybe charging some clients more than others, maybe changing what you offer, a lot of different ways to distribute those costs. Managing things well. You might have to up your game in terms of the way you manage certain aspects of your agency. Adjusting service offerings, so you're perhaps eliminating some services, but maybe you're expanding in other services. And gain market share. Now, I put that on there, and some of my staff said that's a silly thing to say. Yeah, everybody wants to gain market share, but it is essentially a business fact of life for any business that whenever there is turbulence in a marketplace, whatever marketplace, whenever there's turbulence, yeah, there's pain and grief and headaches, but there is also opportunity. And you can bet that there are some agencies out there who will gain from this. I'm not entirely sure how, but there are ways to gain from any kind of turbulence in the marketplace. So keeping your eyes open, keeping a positive attitude about it, looking for ways that people are approaching this that don't just, it's not just about how terrible it is. Find your advantage in this. Management headaches. So, some things to do. Establish clear policies and procedures. Make sure that it's clear to all the people involved what the policies and procedures are, what the processes are, how you decide things. To the extent that you can make those clear, that is going to reduce the number of headaches you'll have. Simplify. I talk to a lot of, totally independent of this, I talk to a lot of agencies who have pretty complicated schemes as to how they pay caregivers, when they pay them more, when they pay them less, and for that matter, how they charge clients. And I can't argue with any of that. Sometimes you have to cut a deal, sometimes you have to talk your way into something, but sometimes it might be worth taking a look at those kinds of things and saying, is there some place we can simplify? We're going to be making some changes. Maybe this is a good time to flatten out some aspects of our pricing or pay structure where possible. It certainly is no blanket fix, but it's certain, it's something to look at. Use good tools. Make sure that the tools you're using for managing your data, for communicating, make sure that they're working well, that you understand how to use them, that the vendor or vendors behind them are backing you up. Make sure that you're not being hampered by the tools that you have. As a software vendor, I hate to say this, but no tools are perfect. But you want to use the best tools you can and make sure that those tools can continue to get better as these changes come in. Wage and hour lawsuits. Scary stuff. So to be in good stead with the law, you want to make sure that you are keeping good records. That goes back to having good tools, but it also is about your procedures. Make sure that you are keeping good records. And it's not a typo that establish clear policies and procedures is there. That's really vital to be able to demonstrate that you really are addressing this and that you don't have a frivolous lawsuit that actually has merit because you just are not dealing with it. The clearer your policies and procedures are, the more likely you are to be able to be in a secure position relative to this stuff. And of course, understand the rules that affect you. It might be dry, it might be uncomfortable, but I definitely recommend checking out some of the stuff on the Department of Labor law site, that's a funny slip, website. I've got a handful of specific links at the end that you might find useful for that. And by the way, we will be sending out an email about this afterwards with a link so that you can listen to this webinar again and also that you can get the slides themselves in case they're useful to you. Okay, moving on. Reduced level of care. So again, this is a tough one. If you're really being pressed and your clients and caregivers are being pressed, it starts to look like you don't have many options, but you've got to keep an open mind. You've got to be creative. Talk with stakeholders. Talk to the people involved. If you've got a great client, you want to keep taking care of them, and the changes are making it hard for you to do that. Talk to the family. Talk to the caregivers involved. Figure out ways that you can continue to provide great help or great care to these people despite the challenges that are coming your way. And get help from whomever you can. That includes me. Whether you're a customer of ours or not, I'm happy to hear from people. I'm happy to talk to you about these things. I really do care about these things beyond the selling of software. As Robin said, I've been in this business for a very long time, and you can't be in this business without absorbing some of the culture of it. And this is really a culture of care in this business. So get some help. People will help. There are a lot of resources out there. I'll include some of those on the final slide. Losing caregivers and clients. This is another one That's tough. In terms of losing caregivers, I think the agencies I see that I'm most confident are going to do great, the caregivers love these people. It's a great place to work. They're well cared for. The people are taking care of them. They'll leave if they have to, but there's a lot of loyalty of a lot of caregivers to agencies and their owners and the people who run them. You want to try to be that. Even if you don't feel like you are that now, don't worry about that. Just be the best place to work that you can be. And of course, provide the best care that you can. That's always a competitive advantage, to provide great care. And collaborate. I've heard some interesting concepts around collaboration where people who might appear to be competitors find ways to collaborate with each other. It's, it might be uncomfortable, but it kind of goes back to the creativity. Open up your sites and say, how can we do this? How can we find ways of making this work for the people that we're providing care for the people who do the caregiving, yeah. So finding enough caregivers. Now this is a big concern, and it's not only about this. If we look, this was an interesting slide. This is from the private duty benchmarking study, the most recent one. And if you don't know about this, this is a fabulous resource for home care agencies. If you don't have a copy of this, I urge you to get one. But you can see from this slide, the biggest concern agencies have is about caregiver shortages. It's more than the companionship exemption, the increasing competition, the Affordable Care Act, privately, all of these things are less of a concern than that. That is a tough part of this business. So finding enough caregivers. Now there are a lot of, I have attended some webinars recently where there are some people out there with some really excellent ideas about recruiting and retention of caregivers. There's a lot of stuff going into this. If you haven't tapped into any of that, I recommend that you do that. Recruiting and retention is a huge thing, and it's worth as much attention as you can pay it, I believe. And again, I like this phrase: be the best place to work. Make it so that that caregivers don't want to leave you, even when the times are tough. That they want to figure out a way to work with you. So let's move on. We could spend all day there, but I want to sort of pull back a little bit and talk about the general approaches that I'm hearing people take to these challenges. So one is to pass on the costs to clients. Different ways to do that. You could raise your prices across the board. You could, I've heard it said that for a lot of agencies, if you bumped your and I haven't done all the math on this, and there's just so many different variations on this, so pardon me on that, but this is anecdotal. If you raise your prices by $1 or $2 an hour, then you've got it covered. That's a lot. For some agencies, that's huge, but that is one approach to do it. Another is to do selected clients. Certainly a lot of people are going to start by doing it with new clients. New client comes on, you've got a different set of rates for those people, and you kind of gradually move your people into paying more. The other thing which is related to that is to pass on the costs on selected shifts. So what I'm referring to there is if let's say that you're scheduling your caregivers out, you've got this caregiver scheduled just about to the edge of overtime, and then you get a client who says, we're going out of town this weekend, we really need this caregiver to come in, and they really love this caregiver and they really want this caregiver, and you say, well, okay, but you're going to have to pay the overtime extra costs because now we have these extra costs. If you're willing to do that, sure, we can do that. You pass those costs on. That's obviously a very simplified example, but that's the basic idea. eliminate or reduce live-ins. Now this kind of makes me sad because I know that there are agencies out there who will be doing this, and I've talked to some who are just completely eliminating live-in services. And the thing that's sad about that is that just those clients who really need that service, some of them may be potentially they're going to be having to no longer get those kind of services. They're going to get less care than they need, or they're going to be in a facility or something like that. And that is a shame if it comes to that. But sometimes you do what you have to do. And another big one is to schedule around overtime. So that's an interesting one, and it has some interesting side effects. So essentially what this means is that you're doing your best to schedule caregivers under 40 hours a week. So before I move, I want to talk a little more about that, but before I move on from this slide, in reality, I think that many, if not most of you, will be doing some of all of this. This is not like pick one of these. Pick from these to come up with the particular mix that is going to work in your particular market with your particular set of clients and caregivers. You'll do fine. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it, but if you really want to succeed in this business, some people, they're tired of it and they're ready to go. But if you really want to succeed, there's no reason you can't. Scheduling more caregivers. This comes up a lot as, oh, that's the answer to dealing with this. Well, for a lot of smaller agencies, this can be a real problem because you start to potentially run in afoul of the Affordable Care Act employer mandate. So if you are suddenly having to hire more caregivers, so you have more essentially part-time caregivers, that has some side effects. So, one employee working 20 hours a week, that's half of an FTE. FTE is full-time equivalent. I hope I don't go too fast on this, but it's really a simple example of something that was brought to my attention fairly recently. I hadn't really thought about this, but that this could be a real problem for smaller agencies who are anywhere near that threshold. So one employee working 20 hours is 0.5 FTEs. One employee working 40 hours is 1 FTE. One employee working 80 hours is 1 FTE. 4 employees working 80 hours is 2 FTE. So the same number of hours being worked can turn into more counted employees in terms of the FTEs that are counted in order for you to be required to pay health insurance or pay the penalty. Okay, so let's move on to the role of software in all of this. This may be pretty obvious to most of you, but biggest thing, of course, is to keep track of that data. You have a responsibility to keep track of these things so you can report on them. Your software should be making that easy for you to do, or even possible for you to do. If you don't use software for some of these things, it may not even be possible to produce the kind of reports you need to. Doing the actual calculations certainly should do that, or at least reduce the difficulty of doing the calculations depending on what you're doing. And it should have some flexibility, because it's my firm belief that there is no one answer to all this. There are different ways of approaching it, different ways of interpreting the law even, and probably we'll see in the coming months and years there will be more changes because maybe some of this stuff will just not be viable and will have to be adjusted. And of course there's different states doing different things over and above this. So flexibility is a really important component of software. You have to be able to do it in different ways. It has to be very visible what's going on. Scheduling visibility is really critical, especially you're trying, even if you're not depending on it, you are certainly going to try to keep caregivers from going into overtime if you can. You need to have that kind of visibility with the software, and And this is an important element, I think, whenever you're dealing with regulations and trying to comply with regulations and concern about lawsuits. One of a very important factor in all this is that you have to really demonstrate that you are trying to do the right thing, that you are making a concerted effort to do the right thing. Because when you, if you do ever find yourself in court, it's going to make a difference if you tried or if you didn't. If you can demonstrate that you put into practice policies and procedures that were designed to do right by the caregivers, you're going to have an easier time than if you either don't have those clear, or if you have policies in there that are so rigid or constrained that you can't sort of fix the outliers. So this is something, I had a conversation recently with an employment law attorney, and he said, we were talking about the difficulties around live-in, and his main thing was, you can't just put in a formulaic approach to it where you say, okay, I mentioned this earlier, you can't just say 16 hours is work time, 8 hours is sleep time, end of story, that's how we pay. You really have to pay for hours that are worked. So if you have, it's fine to have it be, the starting point be that you are paying 16, not paying 8, but you have to be able to adjust those things. You have to pay attention to it. It is going to be more management. You do have to pay attention to it. You can't just set it and forget it. No matter how great you think your software is, it will not cover all of the variations that happen in the world. It just won't. So, in conclusion, plan well and stay calm. There's not much more I need to say about that. Don't panic. Establish clear policies. Keep great records. Keep providing the excellent care that you got in this to provide. And continue the conversation. I sure appreciate you all being with me today. And we're going to get to some of these questions here in a moment. I just want to show you this, a little screen here. You don't really need to grab a pen and write down these URLs. We'll send these to you. Some of these, in fact, there's a couple of them where the URL is so weird that I didn't even put it up here. Some of this, a bunch of this is from the Department of Labor. Some of it is from other private sources. Notice also the ones toward the bottom, Home Care Association of America, Home Care Pulse, Leading Home Care. These are 3 organizations that are in it to help people figure this stuff out. And there are others. These are the ones that I have the closest association with and am most familiar with. But these people have approaches and resources and actual materials that you will find useful. If you aren't tied into anything like that, I sure hope that you will consider getting involved with that. If you as I mentioned, there's my contact information, customer or not, interested in being a customer or not. I'm available and interested in talking with you if you're interested in talking with me. Okay, so we're going to now take a look at some of these questions, and Robin's going to help me out with this because I've been talking away without paying any attention to these questions. So. Okay,
so the first question we have, which we might have already touched on, is will we have access to these slides after this webinar?
Indeed we will. So we are going to send these out. It'll include a link to listen to this webinar and watch it, the actual recording of the webinar, but also just the slide deck in case you want to study it. So.
Here's another question. We do not have employees. All our providers are independent contractors. We know changes are in the works for independent contractors and wonder how will all of this information apply to our situation? And we've gotten this question a couple of times about whether or not independent contractors are going to fall under these same restrictions and changes.
Well, I have only just started talking with a couple of our agencies who do this about this. When I first had conversations with them, they were pretty much not very concerned, frankly. But that has been changing. It seems to me, and frankly, this is conjecture. I do not know. This is something that I'm sure that I will come to know a lot more about in the coming weeks and months. But it seems like it comes back to, are they really employees or not? Because that seems like that's an interesting question that I don't really understand how that can be truly determined. Just because you call, I know there are very particular things. You don't pay them. You don't make their schedule. Various things like that. But there are still some gray lines, and in some of the reading that I did prior to this webinar, I did run across some things that made it sound like the biggest question there is whether those distinctions will remain in place. And I really don't know the answer to that question. I'm interested in knowing, though, because we do have plenty of customers who are doing that. It just hasn't been part of the conversation with those people so far.
Okay, and another question we've gotten in a couple of different ways is travel time considered hours worked? And does that contribute to overtime? And then also, is travel time paid at the normal hourly rate? And if they're already paying for mileage for travel time, does that count? So it's a whole kind of travel time question.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of different little twists and turns on this. I think the basics of it are that, yes, it is work time. So it does need to count into figuring for overtime. Now, paying mileage, to my knowledge, that is not a requirement of this law or of any of the state laws that I've looked into in particular. And I could be wrong about that. But I think paying mileage is more, it seems to be something more of a choice that agencies make as a sort of an enticement to and a help to their caregivers. But I don't believe that is part of, has any effect on the overtime situation at all. Now, the other part of that question was the rate that will be used. If you're doing averaging, I would say that it probably needs to count into that. But in general, it is more of a kind of thing that you set what people get. And people, everybody's time in the car is of the same value, essentially. That could be argued up one side and down the other, but essentially, I think that that's a pretty safe position, that you pay them a particular rate, a legal rate, but a particular rate to drive in the car, and you aren't switching that rate around from caregiver to caregiver. And I know right away, that comes out of my mouth, I know there are people out there who are paying the travel time at different rates. But that seems to be all over the place at this point. That doesn't seem to have settled down, at least not in my view.
Okay, we have another question about live-ins. Is there any language in the federal wage and hours law that speaks to a requirement to compensate employees if they're engaged to wait, meaning if they're required to get up during the night on a live-in case if the client needs them?
They are engaged to wait. There is language to that effect, but
something like sleep interruptions.
Well, sleep interruptions, but if I'm understanding this question, it's maybe a little different than interruptions. Interruptions are clear. If they've got, they're supposed to have 8 hours off and that gets interrupted for 2 hours, yeah, they got to get paid for that. If I'm understanding the question correctly, it's more about the fact that they have to be willing and able to get up at any moment. That essentially means that they are working during that whole time. That is an interpretation I have heard. I don't believe that anyone has come up with a definitive, this is what it is, and I bet there's several opinions bubbling away out there right as we speak about that. But I have spoken with some employment law people, and I have not heard that that can be applied in that way. I hope not. So I hope I answered that question. It's kind of squishy for me, but.
Okay, and so next question we have is, can you get around the overtime for live-ins or aides routinely doing a lot of hours by making them salaried employees?
Well, salaried employees are supposed to be paid overtime as well. That's kind of a different thing and something I have not looked into, but I know that that is the case, that officially you are supposed to pay overtime to salaried people. So I doubt that there's a loophole there that would hold up in court. It might be something you can use, and it's kind of a weird thing about this whole thing and about, you know, being in compliance with laws. I mean, if you read these laws, you actually read the words in them. 10 different lawyers will come up with 10 different interpretations of what exactly that means relative to any particular thing. That's why I say this thing, I'm not just being, I don't think I'm just being simple-minded about saying make it clear that you are making the best effort possible to do right by your employees. I think that's a real thing, because you get it into a courtroom and that's when they start actually pulling apart all the pieces, they tug at all the threads, and they come up with a ruling, and then that ruling clarifies some aspect of that. And, you know, down the road, some other ruling will clarify some other aspect or tear down that other one. It is a moving, the ground does move under your feet. What can I say?
Okay, what's the minimum number of hours to be considered FTE?
I believe that's 30. Is that correct? Yeah. Now that I haven't been thinking about the FTEs lately. We did a lot of work on that back when the Affordable Care Act hit. I'm a little fuzzy about that right at the moment. So that slide is probably incorrect. Okay, so.
And then one more question was, okay, we have had numerous caregivers asking if they could sign a voluntary waiver that they do not want overtime for hours over 40. I told them that I thought this was not legal. Am I correct?
That's an interesting thing. I think it is probably not legal. But that's just what I'm talking about talking to your constituents. I mean, that's it ought to be. It ought to be legal. I think I'm gonna chat with my employment law buddies and see what they say about that. But I'll bet you that they would say no, that's not really that doesn't really fly. It sure seems like it ought to, though. I'm gonna ask about that. It's I want to just be clear. I am very optimistic about all this. Not everyone is. I am optimistic. People are amazing, and despite whatever kind of roadblocks you throw in their way, they figure out ways to make it work. And this is a human-made set of roadblocks, and humans are going to figure out how to deal with it. So I hope that last idea is legal, because that's a great idea.
Okay, so we have time for just one more question, and that's going to be, does anyone know if these exemptions apply to families who hire caregivers privately?
I wanted to address that during the presentation. I skipped over it. That is one of the concerns that has come up about, sort of basically unfair competition, both in terms of, fly-by-night agencies who are just going to ignore all this, and private, families taking caregivers private. The problem with the private thing is that, they might be able to fly under the radar more easily, so they could go against it, but they're only exempt if the caregiver does less than 20% spends less than 20% of their time on care activities. And there's this whole discussion in the law about what are care activities, but they can't be spending all their time doing direct care for the family and still have the family be exempt. As I said, they might fly under the radar that way, but they are out of compliance if they're doing that. So that's a good thing to let your clients know. get some information about that. So, if they want to take a caregiver in privately, they can, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to be exempt from that. What strikes me as maybe a thing to explore is that there be some way of having it be that you are, there's joint employment where you, the family hires caregivers for part of the time and the agency hires them for part of the time. I'm not really sure that quite the legality of that, but that is something that is mentioned in the law. I'm not sure exactly where the lines are about that, but that's the kind of creative approaches that people are going to be taking, and I really look forward to seeing some of this creativity. I think it's going to lead to some great things. So we are running out of time here. Thank you very much for coming today. I hope that this has been useful to you. The slide deck will be available as well as the recording of the webinar as soon as we can get it posted. I thank you very much. I see that we actually had so many people on the call today that some people were not able to get in, so we may need to repeat this webinar. We'll see how that all falls out. But again, thank you very much. I look forward to talking with you again. And
thank you again for joining us, and we will have this posted and send out an email letting you get access to this webinar. So everyone have a lovely Tuesday.